At my son's wedding dinner, my daughter-in-law lifted the small wooden box I'd given them, gave it a little shake next to her ear like she was checking whether it was empty, and opened the lid in front of the whole table. Her face fell. Then she laughed a bright, performing laugh, pitched for the room, and she said, "We asked for cash, not old family junk." A few people laughed with her, the way people do when the loudest person decides what's funny. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I reached across the table, gently lifted the box back out of her hands, closed the lid, and said the only thing I said all night, "You're right, dear. It's not for you." And I gathered my coat and I left before the dessert came. 3 hours later, my phone rang. It was my son, and his voice was shaking before he got a single word out. "Mom," he said. "Mom, there's a folded paper inside this. Is this a property deed? Is this the land I was sitting at the little kitchen table in my rented apartment?" The box back in my lap. The deed still folded inside it where it had been for 9 years. Waiting. And I said, very gently, "Why do you ask?" "Daniel, because here is what my daughter-in-law called old family junk, in front of 60 people, and laughed at. And here is what happened when this whole family finally learned what was folded inside it. Welcome back to Calm Mom Revenge, where the thing they call junk is so often the only thing in the room that 3 generations bled for. Stay with me to the very end. This one turns in a way nobody at that table saw coming. Leave a comment. And be sure to subscribe. My name is Margaret Holloway. I'm 65 years old. And for most of my life I have understood something. The young woman at that table had never once been taught that the most valuable things a family owns almost never look like much. And the things that look like much are almost never worth what people paid. I learned that on 11 acres of stony farmland an hour north of here, land my husband's grandfather cleared by hand with a borrowed mule and a back that never stopped aching after. I learned it watching 3 generations of men love a piece of dirt that no banker ever thought was worth a second look. And I learned it, most of all, the year I sold my own house, the only home I'd ever owned, to save the life of the very son who would one day sit silent while his bride laughed at what was left. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you the thing I've told almost no one, because without it nothing else will land the way it should. 9 years ago, my son Daniel got sick. Not the kind of sick you walk off. There was a surgery, and then a complication, and then a second surgery, and bills that arrived faster than I could read them. In a year when his own small insurance had already thrown up its hands. He was 31. He was going to be all right, the doctors were fairly sure, but only if we kept going. And keeping going cost more money than I had. More money than I would ever have. So I did the only thing a mother in that position can do. I sold my house. The little blue house with the crooked porch where I'd raised him, where his father had died, where I'd planned, God help me, to grow old. I sold it in 11 days to a cash buyer for less than it was worth because we didn't have the luxury of waiting for a fair price. And I poured every dollar of it into keeping my boy alive. I have never told Daniel that's where the money came from. He thinks I had savings. I let him think it. Because a mother doesn't hand her child a debt like that to carry it isn't a gift if it comes with a weight. So for 9 years I have lived in a rented apartment with thin walls and a radiator that knocks. And I have never once been sorry. I would sell 10 houses. I would sell my hands. That was never the hard part. I want you to hold on to that. Because here is the cruelty of what happened at that dinner. The young woman who lifted my gift and laughed and said we asked for cash. Not old family junk. She had no idea she was saying it to a woman who had turned her entire home into cash. Every brick of it. And handed it over without a word. To keep the man sitting beside her alive. She thought she was mocking a sentimental old lady with a box of clutter. She was mocking the only person at that table who had ever actually traded everything she owned for love. In the one currency, Vanessa understood, And the thing I had brought in that wooden box, the thing she called junk, was the last piece of land my family had left on this earth. 3 generations deep. And I had brought it to give to her, because Vanessa looked at that box and saw something worthless. And I am perhaps the only person alive who could have told her what she was holding. To understand that, you have to understand the land. And the 3 men who broke their bodies on it, and why my husband Joseph made me promise to give it away in a wooden box instead of a bank envelope. So let me take you back past the dinner, past the house I sold, all the way to a man named Tomas who got off a boat with $11 and bought 11 acres nobody else wanted. It starts with land that everyone said was worthless, and turned out to be worth everything. Tomas Holloway came off a boat in 1911 with $11 sewn into the waist of his trousers and not one word of English in his mouth. He was Joseph's grandfather, and the story of him is the story of that wooden box. So stay with me. He worked 3 years in a slaughterhouse in the city, saving in a way that I don't think people save anymore, not setting aside what was left over, but living on what was left over and saving the rest first. And when he had enough, he didn't buy a house. And he didn't buy a fine coat. And he didn't buy himself one single comfortable thing. He bought 11 acres of stony end of race, sloping farmland an hour north of here, land the bank was glad to be rid of. Land the man who sold it to him actually apologized for, because everyone agreed it was no good. Too many rocks. A spring that flooded the low corner. Soil that 2 previous families had given up on and walked away from. Tomas cleared it by hand. He had a borrowed mule the first spring and his own back every spring after slice. He pulled stones out of that ground for 30 years, and here is the thing I want you to understand. The thing that is the whole soul of this. He didn't throw the stones away. He built them into walls. The boundary walls of that farm, the ones still standing today, are made of every rock that ground tried to refuse him. He took the very things that made the land worthless, and he made them the thing that held it together. There's a sermon in that, and I'll let you find it yourself. By the time Tomas died, 11 acres, nobody wanted fed a family. And a little more. He left it to his son Joseph's father, a quiet man named Peter, and Peter did the thing that turned a farm into a tradition. He took a small wooden box that Tomas had carved on winter evenings, a plain thing of pale wood with a lid that fit so well, it sighed when you closed it. And into that box Peter put the deed to the land. And he put one more thing beside it, a fistful of the actual soil. The dark, hard-won dirt from the cleared field, sewn into a small square of cloth so it wouldn't spill. So whoever holds this, Peter used to say, holds the dirt. Not just the paper. The paper says you own it. The dirt says you understand it. The dirt says you understand it. I have thought about that sentence every day since the wedding. Peter added the soil. And when the land came to Joseph, my Joseph, he kept the box and the deed and the little cloth of dirt. And he added the third thing. He added the receipts. Every year that family had owed money on that land, and there were lean years. Years they nearly lost it. Years Joseph's mother sold eggs at the roadside to make a payment they had kept the receipt. The yellowed slips. Decades of them. Each one a year the family had held on by its fingernails. Joseph bound them with a ribbon and laid them in the box beneath the deed. Anyone can inherit land, he told me once, turning that ribbon stack in his hands. I want whoever gets this to inherit the holding on Pelson. The deed is what we own. These he tapped the receipts. These are what it cost us not to let go. 3 generations. 3 things in one plain wooden box. The deed. From Peter. The dirt. From Peter. The receipts. From Joseph. The paper. The understanding. And the cost. To anyone who didn't know, to a young woman at a wedding dinner. Sigh. Expecting an envelope of cash, it would look like exactly what she called it. Old paper. A bag of dirt. Junk. Now. I have to tell you why that land was never sold. Even in our own hardest year, even the year I sold my own house out from under myself. Because you might be wondering, if I was so broke, I had to sell my home to save Daniel. Why didn't I sell 11 acres of farmland instead? I almost did. God forgive me. I sat at the lawyer's office with the papers in front of me, ready to sell the land and keep my house. And then I remembered Joseph on his last morning, and I couldn't do it. Because that land was the one thing in the world that wasn't only mine, it belonged to Tomas, and Peter, and Joseph, and to the son I was trying to save, and to his children who weren't born yet. My house was mine to sell. The land was not mine to end. So I sold what was mine, and I kept what was theirs. And I have never told a living soul that's the choice I made in that office. Until right now. Telling you, I won't tell you yet what those 11 acres are worth today. I had it valued last year. Quietly. And the number is not what anyone clearing rocks in 1911 could have dreamed. You'll hear it the same night. Daniel's whole family heard it. Read out at my kitchen table, not one number sooner. Because you should feel it land the way they felt it. But the value was never the reason Joseph made me promise what he made me promise. Here is the promise. In his last weeks it was his heart. And it was fast. And we had less time than we thought. Joseph held that wooden box on his lap in the hospital bed and made me swear 2 things. First, that the land would go to Daniel and his wife on their wedding day, to build a life on, the way Tomas had wanted someone to build a life on it. And second, this is the part that matters, that I would not hand it over as a deed in an envelope. The way you'd transfer a parking space. Make her open the box. Margaret, he said, make them take the dirt out. And the receipts. And read what it cost. A deed in an envelope is just an address. I want them to hold the whole 100 years. He pressed the box at me with hands that had gone so thin. Don't let it be easy. Easy is how people lose things that were hard to get. Make her open the box. That was very nearly the last clear instruction my husband ever gave me. And I intended to honor it perfectly. And because Joseph knew, his son knew Daniel was gentle, and went quiet to keep a room calm. The way good soft men do, he worried the meaning might be too quiet to survive. So in his last week he had me write a letter, dictated between the hard breaths, to be folded inside the box beneath the deed, a letter explaining Tomas and the stones and the dirt and the receipts, so that whoever opened it would understand they weren't being handed real estate. They were being handed 100 years of a family refusing to let go. I sealed it. I laid it in the box. And I waited for my son to find someone to build a life with. I waited 9 years. And then Daniel brought home Vanessa. And for a while, I want to be fair. I want to be honest for a while. I let myself believe the box had found its bride. I want to be careful with Vanessa. Because the easy thing would be to paint her as a monster. And the truth is sadder and more useful than a monster. The sad part is the part that explains her. My daughter-in-law grew up the only child of a woman named Sharon, who survived a hard divorce when Vanessa was 9 and came out the other side of it, having decided that money was the only thing in this world that doesn't leave you. I don't say that unkindly. Sharon had been left with nothing once, frightened and broke, with a child. And she rebuilt herself on a single iron belief that you trust what's liquid, what's countable, what you can hold in your hand today, and you do not, ever, put your faith in sentiment, or promises, or things people swear will matter later. Cash is real. Everything else is a story people tell you while they take what's yours. Vanessa was raised inside that belief, the way other children are raised inside a religion. So Vanessa keeps score in dollars. Because dollars were the only thing her mother ever taught her to count as safe. A gift isn't love to her, it's a figure. Their wedding registry was, more than anything, a fundraiser they had asked, explicitly, on the invitations, for cash contributions toward a down payment. And Sharon had made sure every guest understood that a check was the only acceptable form of affection. To Vanessa, a person who showed up with anything other than money was a person who hadn't taken her seriously. She wasn't wrong to want a future. She was only taught, by a frightened woman, that the future is a thing you buy, and never a thing you inherit. I tried to like her. I did. And I need you to know that. Because what I did later was not done out of dislike. In the early days, she wasn't openly cruel, she was just transactional. In a way that left me cold without ever giving me anything to point at. She'd ask, almost the first time we met, what Daniel and I had, in the way you'd assess a property. She'd mention, lightly, that her friend's mothers-in-law had gifted this or contributed that. And underneath it I came to understand that Vanessa was afraid the way Sharon had taught her to be, that if she ever relaxed, ever trusted a promise instead of a payment, the floor would open the way it opened on her mother. And the cruel joke of people built that way is that they cannot recognize the genuinely precious when it's set in front of them, because it arrives as a story instead of a sum. She was about to prove that in front of 60 people, she just had no idea what she was holding when she did. And now I have to tell you about my son, Daniel. Because the part of this that still keeps me awake at night is not Vanessa. It's him. Daniel is a good man who has spent his whole life stepping around conflict the way you'd step around a sleeping dog carefully. Quietly. Hoping it doesn't wake. He's gentle. He's funny when he forgets to be cautious. He worshipped his father, and after Joseph died, he grieved the way soft men do. Privately, tidily, somewhere, it wouldn't trouble anybody. And he owes me his life, though he doesn't know the shape of that debt. Doesn't know about the blue house. And I have worked hard to keep it that way. Because love that's held over someone's head stops being love. But he fell hard for Vanessa. And somewhere in the falling, he started going quiet, agreeing, smoothing. When Sharon swept in and turned the wedding into a campaign for cash, Daniel just went along. Because going along was easier. And easier is the path my son has taken at every fork in his life. I watched it happen over 2 years, the way you watch water find the low ground, never any single dramatic moment. Just a steady, downhill yielding. Until one day the man standing there isn't quite standing on anything of his own. I tell you this now, before the dinner, because I need you to understand what it would cost him. When the truth finally came out, it didn't break. Vanessa, as you'll see, doesn't break. She renegotiates until she's the wronged party. It broke Daniel. Because Daniel was sitting right there when his bride held up his father's box and laughed and called 100 years of his family junk. And Daniel, gentle, peacekeeping, choosing easier, gave a small, nervous laugh along with the table, and said nothing. He didn't know what was folded inside. I'll grant him that. Always. But he knew that box. He'd seen it his whole childhood. He knew his father had held it on a hospital bed. And he laughed. Softly. To keep the peace. While his wife mocked it. That is the thing my son will carry the rest of his life, not her cruelty. His own small laugh. Remember that. When we get to the phone call, the wedding dinner was Sharon's production. And you could tell. It was held in the private room of a steakhouse, expensive enough to make a point of itself. 60 guests at a long table under low gold light. Place cards. A printed menu. The works. I'd been told, gently, by Vanessa herself, that the preferred gift was a contribution. And I had nodded and said, of course. I did contribute. In fact, I'd quietly put what cash I could spare into a card. because I'm not a fool, and I wanted them to have something for the down payment too. But the cash was the small gift. The box was the real one. The box was 11 acres and 100 years, and the last land my family owned, and I'd carried it in there to hand to them on the night they started their life. I was, that evening, simply happy. My only son was married. The box had waited 9 years in my rented apartment for exactly this. I had even practiced what I'd say when I gave it not a speech. Just a few quiet words about Joseph. And the dirt. And don't open it here. Open it at home. The night you move in. And read what's inside first. I had no armor on. Walking into that steakhouse. Why would I? You don't bring armor to your child's wedding dinner. You bring a box and a full heart, and you trust that on a night like this, the people at the table will at least be kind. I want you to hold that picture. Because it's the part I grieve. I walked in carrying 100 years of my family in a plain wooden box. I'm glad to give it all away with both hands. And I handed it. Across a table of strangers in good clothes. To a young woman who shook it next to her ear to find out if it was empty. I was about to learn that some rooms will laugh at the last thing your family owns and call it asking for what they're owed. The gifts came near the end of the dinner. After the plates were cleared. And Sharon ran that part too. She had Vanessa open them at the head of the table. One at a time. So the room could see, and so the room could see. Mostly. That they were checks. Envelope after envelope. Each one opened. The amount noted with a little pleased sound. The giver thanked by name. It was less a celebration than an accounting. I sat near the far end and watched a young woman tally her own wedding in real time. And I thought about a wooden box waiting in my bag. And I held my secret, the way you hold something warm in a cold room. Then there were 2 gifts left. My card with its modest cash, which she opened first, and thanked me for, in a flat, even voice that told me the amount hadn't impressed anyone. And then the box, she picked it up, and I watched her weigh it in her hands and frown, because it didn't feel like what she expected. And then I will see this for the rest of my life. She lifted it to her ear and gave it a small shake. The way a child shakes a present to guess at it. Except there was nothing childlike in her face. She was checking whether it was empty. Whether the old woman at the end of the table had given them a literal empty box. What happened next happened fast. And I have replayed it in slow motion 10,000 times since. She opened the lid, and I watched her face do the arithmetic. Right there in the gold light. In front of 60 people. I watched her take in the folded paper. Gone soft and yellow at the creases. The little cloth pouch of dirt. The ribbon stack of receipts that looked, to her, like an old woman's hoarded clutter. The very things that were the soul of it, the dirt that says you understand it. The receipts that say what it cost not to let go. She looked straight at them, with her sharp young eyes, and saw garbage. I watched her decide what it meant. And I watched her decide. With a camera somewhere down the table and a room to play to. That the funny thing, the on-brand thing, was to make a little show of it. Her nose wrinkled. She lifted the cloth of dirt between 2 fingers like something she'd found under a sink. And she laughed, her bright performing laugh. And she said it to the whole table. We asked for cash. She said. Not old family junk. The room did that awful thing. Not everyone laughed. But enough the follow the leader laugh of people who've quietly decided the loud, pretty person is the one who's being funny. Sharon laughed loudest. And the dirt, Tomas's dirt. 100 years of a family's understanding of its own ground sat pinched between my daughter-in-law's 2 manicured fingers, held up for a laugh. While 60 strangers chuckled, now here is the worst second of the entire night. It was not the laugh. It was not the word junk. It was that I looked down the table at my son at Daniel, who had just heard his wife hold up his dying father's box and call it garbage, and I watched my boy's face. And my boy gave a small, soft laugh. To keep the peace. To not make a thing of it on his wife's big night. He laughed. Quietly. And then he looked down at his plate. That was the worst second. Not the box. My son's small laugh. And then his eyes going down to his plate. Now here is the hinge of this whole story. So stay with me. Because everything turned on it. I had a choice in that second. I could have stood up. I could have said, down the length of that table. In front of all of them, you foolish girl. That dirt was carried out of a cleared field by a man who got off a boat with $11. Those receipts are 60 years of this family nearly losing everything and holding on anyway. And that folded paper you're laughing at is the deed to 11 acres I was about to put in your hands tonight. I could have made a scene that lived in that family for 50 years. And part of me wanted to. Badly. But I didn't, and 3 things decided it. All true at once. The deed and the letter were safe in the box. In reach of my own hand, she hadn't read a word of either. And now she wouldn't. The cruelty was happening in front of 60 witnesses, and a camera with an Elwers, which meant the truth would keep without any help from me. And this is the one that settled it. I looked at that laughing, performing, frightened young woman. And I understood that the worst thing I could possibly do to her was not to shout. It was to take the box back quietly. Let her keep her laugh in full. On the record. And hand her the truth later. When she could no longer pretend it hadn't happened. So I did the only thing with any dignity left in it. I stood. And I walked the length of that table. And I reached out and gently took the box out of her hands. I lifted the little cloth of dirt from her fingers and set it back inside. The way you take something fragile from a child who didn't know what it was? The room had gone quiet. The laugh had curdled. Vanessa. Feeling the wind shift. Covered it with a bright, "Oh, did you want it back? That's totally fine. You're right. Dear." I said. My voice was perfectly steady. "It's not for you." And I closed the lid. And it sighed, the way Tomas's lid has always sighed. And I tucked the box under my arm. "I think I'll head home," I said gently. To the table. "Congratulations to you both." I found the eyes of Daniel's Aunt Ruth across the room. Ruth, who'd loved this family 40 years and had gone white watching, and I gave her a small nod. And I gathered my coat. And I carried 100 years of Holloways out of that steakhouse with my back straight. If you have ever set something down in front of people you trusted, something with your whole family folded inside it, and watched them laugh because it didn't come in the shape they wanted, then you know the particular silence that follows. The silence of deciding how much of yourself you'll defend in a room that's already decided you don't count. If that silence is familiar to you, stay with me. Because this is exactly where it turns. I did not cry until I reached the car. In the car, with the door shut and that steakhouse glowing behind me, I let myself come apart for as long as it took to feel it. I held the box against my chest. The lid had come open a half-inch. And I could smell it, the dry, mineral smell of that dirt. The smell of a cleared field. The smell of Joseph's hands when he came in at dusk. And somehow his ground, his smell, on the night his son got married without him, was the thing that undid me. "I'm sorry, Joseph," I whispered into the dark. She laughed at it. And Daniel laughed too. I couldn't even give it to them. But grief and clarity can ride in the same car. And by the time my tears slowed, something underneath had gone very still and very certain. I was not going to fold 100 years of holding on into the hands of a girl who'd held the dirt up for a laugh, not the way it was. Not yet. Joseph's wish had been make her open the box. Make them read what it cost. You cannot hand the holding on to someone who has never once held on to anything. But the land still had somewhere it needed to go. And the truth still needed laying out. Once. In the light. In front of every person who'd laughed or looked away. So somewhere on the drive back to my rented rooms, I stopped crying. And I started quietly. The way Joseph used to walk the fence line deciding what needed mending to think. The phone was already ringing when I came through my door. It wasn't Daniel. Not yet. It was Ruth. Margaret. Ruth's voice was tight as a fist. I just watched you carry that box out to the parking lot. And I am so ashamed of every person who sat there and laughed. I should have stood up. I didn't. And I'm sorry. It's all right. Ruth, I said. And I was surprised to find my voice steady. She didn't know what it was. None of them did. A pause. And then Ruth said the thing that lit the fuse. Though neither of us knew yet that it was a fuse. Margaret, does Daniel even know what's in that box? Because after you left, I went to him. I was so upset I wasn't thinking. And I said it. I said, your wife just laughed at the deed to your grandfather's land. The 11 acres. The dirt your great-grandfather cleared. And Margaret, her voice caught his face. He went the color of ash. I don't think he knew that's what you'd brought. I think I just told him what his wife held up for a laugh. I closed my eyes. It's all right. Ruth. I said again, though, my heart had already turned. Away from Vanessa. Toward my son. There's more. Ruth said. Lower now. He started saying something half to himself. I don't think he meant me to hear it. He said. She sold things for me before. She always sells things for me. And then he just stopped. And went out to the lot with his phone. Margaret, what did he mean by that? I held the phone a moment and didn't answer her. Because the answer was 9 years old and I had never said it out loud to anyone. She sold things for me before. He didn't know the half of it. He didn't know it was the whole house. But some buried part of my son had always sensed that his survival had been paid for in something of mine. And Ruth had just knocked loose the corner of it. I'll talk to him. Ruth. I said. Thank you. And I hung up. And I stood in my small rented kitchen, holding the box. And I understood that across town my son was sitting in a parking lot with 2 pieces of information detonating in him at once what was in the box. And the dawning, wordless suspicion of what I'd given up before. And what it might have cost me to be standing in a rented apartment at 65. I put the kettle on. And I waited. Because I knew Daniel would call. 2 minutes later, he did. Before I tell you about that call, let me tell you what I did in those 2 minutes. Because it matters. I set the box on my little kitchen table, and I opened it not to take anything out. Only to be sure. Only to touch it, and know it was whole after everything. The deed. Soft at its folds. The cloth of dirt. None of it spilled. The receipts under their ribbon. 60 years of a family holding on. And beneath the deed, the sealed letter in Joseph's careful hand, for Daniel and his wife. Read this first. I ran my thumb over his handwriting, and I thought about him dictating it between hard breaths, determined that 100 years would survive a loud world. And a young woman raised to trust only what's countable had come within one unread letter of laughing all of it into a donation pile. Make her open the box. Joseph had said, Vanessa had made certain it was never opened at all. That is the bitter joke at the center of this, the only instruction. And she skipped it without even knowing it existed. Then the phone rang. And it was my son. And he was crying before he got a word out. I learned later what those minutes had been like for him. And I'll tell it the way he told me. He'd sat at that table, he said, in the seconds after the laugh, fighting the urge to get up and take the box back himself, and losing, because Vanessa was laughing and the room was warm and getting up would have made a thing of it on her night. The old reflex. Choose easier. And then Ruth was at his shoulder saying, your grandfather's land. The dirt your great-grandfather cleared. And Daniel said it was like the chair went out from under him. He looked down the table. And I was already gone. The box gone with me. And for one cold minute, he thought I'd taken it away forever, that he'd laughed his family's last land out of his own life. If you have ever watched someone you love begin to understand, too late, exactly what their silence cost, then you already know the sound I heard next. Mum. His voice broke clean on the one syllable. Mum. Please tell me you have the box. Please tell me you took it home. I have it. Sweetheart. I said. It's right here on my kitchen table. It's safe. He exhaled a long, shaking breath, like a man surfacing that turned halfway into something that wasn't quite a sob. There's a deed in here. Isn't there? He said. Is it the land? Granddad's land? It's the land. Danielle. I said gently. 11 acres. Your great-grandfather Tomas cleared it by hand. Your grandfather kept the receipts from every year. The family nearly lost it. The dirt in that cloth is from the field Tomas cleared. And there's a letter from your father? Dictated to me in the hospital. To be read the night you moved in. I let it sit. That's what was in the box. Sweetheart. That's what you watched your wife hold up for a laugh. And that's what I'd brought to put in your hands tonight. The line went very, very quiet. And then my gentle, peacekeeping son made a sound I had not heard from him since he was small. Ara. Helpless. Breaking sound. I laughed. Mom? He said. I was sitting right there, and I laughed. I heard her say it, and I laughed so it wouldn't be a thing. I let him cry. Sometimes that is the whole job of being a mother. You let them cry. And you don't rush it. And you don't fix it too fast. Mom, he said, when he could. And his voice changed. Went careful and frightened. Ruth said something tonight. She said you sold things for me. And I keep Mom. The year I was sick. 9 years ago. You said you had savings? Did you? He couldn't finish it. And here? I made a choice of my own. Because there are things a mother spares her child, and there are things a man needs in full. And I had to decide in one breath which this was. I decided he was about to be a husband. And a father someday. And he needed to understand exactly what the box in his family meant before he could ever be trusted to carry it. I sold the house. Danielle, I said, the blue one, to a cash buyer. In 11 days. For less than it was worth. Because we didn't have time to wait. That's the savings. That's where the money came from. I kept my voice gentle. I'm not telling you to make you carry it. I kept it from you 9 years for exactly that reason. I'm telling you because tonight your wife laughed at the last land this family owns and called it junk, and you should know that the woman who carried it into that room had already turned her own home into cash. Every brick. To keep you alive. So you'd know what it actually looks like when someone gives you everything they have. It doesn't look like a check. Sweetheart. It never has. There was a silence on the line, so complete I could hear the radiator knock. And then my son wept in a way that frightened me a little. The way a man weeps when several years of his life rearrange themselves at once. You've been in that apartment for 9 years. He said. Because of me. Because I wanted to. I said, there's a difference. And I need you to hear it. I would sell 10 houses. That part was never hard. How are you so calm? He whispered. I'd understand if you never spoke to either of us again. Because I have it. Daniel. I said. Because the land is safe on my table. And you are going to get every word of your father's letter. Read the way he wanted it read. Nothing that mattered was actually lost tonight except a few illusions. And those needed losing. And because calm is the only weapon I've ever found that the people who laugh can't argue with. He was quiet, a long moment. Then, in a smaller voice. He told me the thing that decided the rest of it, I think, to warn me. Not to wound me. Mom. I have to tell you what she said. After Ruth told her. When Vanessa finally understood there'd been a deed, and Dad's letter in that box, her first words weren't, "Oh my God," or "Is your mother okay?" She said he swallowed, she said. Well, why would she put a deed in a box that looks like trash? Who does that, honestly? She set me up to look bad. She set me up to look bad. I sat with that at my little table. And I want to tell you, that sentence is the whole of Vanessa. Caught doing something close to unforgivable. Her first instinct wasn't remorse, it was renegotiation. Rearranging the story until she was the wronged one. Until a 100-year-old box was a trap an old woman had sprung on her. Not once did she say, "I'm sorry," and mean it. I want you to hold that. Because it shaped what I did next. I did not do it out of cruelty. I did it because a woman who answers that box held your husband's inheritance and his dying father's letter with, "She set me up to look bad," is not a woman into whose open hands you place 100 years of holding on. Not yet. That has to be earned. Tell me what you want to do. Daniel said, and I'll do it. For once in my life, I'll do the right thing instead of the easy one. And there it was, the first real spine I'd heard in my son's voice in years. It had cost him this much to find it. Maybe it always does. Better late. I thought. Sitting there with Joseph's box open in front of me. Better late. Joseph, I want one thing. I told him. I want the whole family at my table. You. And your Aunt Ruth. And Vanessa. And Sharon if she'll come. And I'm going to open your father's box in front of all of them. In the light. And read his letter out loud the way he asked, and show every person who laughed exactly what they laughed at. He let it land. Your father said, "Make her open the box." So we're going to open it. Just a little later than he planned. And to a larger room. That night I didn't sleep much. I sat a long while with the box and a cup of tea gone cold. And I did the other kind of thinking. The slow, careful, fence line kind. Because by morning I'd understood how to honor a dying man's wish in a way that no one, not Vanessa, not Sharon, not even my own soft-hearted son could ever laugh off. Orundu. Or hand back in an envelope. So the next morning, with my reading glasses on and Joseph's letter in front of me and a feisty, I started making some calls of my own. Quiet ones. The kind of woman who has been underestimated her whole life learns to make very lanals. Very well. It took 10 days to arrange one, and I used every one of them. First, I did the thing I'd been putting off for a year. I had the land valued properly. By a surveyor and an appraiser who walked all 11 acres with me on a cold, bright morning. The stone walls Tomas built still standing along every line of it. I'd always known the land was worth something. What I hadn't let myself know was how much, because here is what happened to 11 stony acres that nobody wanted in 1911. The city grew north. A highway interchange went in 4 miles east. The worthless farm an hour from anywhere became a parcel inside a ring of new development, zoned now for housing. The spring in the low corner reclassified from a nuisance into protected wetland that made the rest of the lot only more desirable. The appraiser stood at the top of the cleared field, where Tomas pulled the first stones, and told me the number. I won't make you wait the way the family had to. 11 acres a man bought with $11 sewn into his trousers. The land my daughter-in-law pinched between 2 fingers and called junk came in at just over $600,000. $600,000. Held up for a laugh. Called old family junk. In front of 60 people. By a young woman who'd asked, instead, for cash. Then I went to see a woman named Patricia, who handles these things. And I did the careful, permanent thing. I put the land into a trust. Not in Vanessa's name. And not loose in Daniel's, either into a family trust, held for the next generation. For a grandchild, not yet born. To be used to build a life on the way Tomas wanted someone to build a life on it. It cannot be sold for quick cash. It cannot be borrowed against to fund a lifestyle. And I wrote in the one condition that mattered. It is released only to an heir who has first opened the box, taken out the dirt and the receipts with their own hands, and read Joseph's letter aloud. In front of the family. The land goes only to someone who has held the holding on. Joseph said, "Make her open the box." I made it so the box can never be skipped again. And then I invited them all to Sunday dinner. My small apartment. Everyone. They came on a gray Sunday evening into rooms that smelled of the paprika stew Joseph loved. Because some weapons are kindness. And a warm kitchen is the oldest one I own. Daniel. Hollow and quiet. The way he'd been on the phone. Vanessa. Polished and wary. Her eyes going to the table the moment she stepped in. Sharon. Who had come because not coming would have looked worse. And Ruth. Who arrived early to stand at my shoulder. They had to see where I lived to get to my table, the thin walls. The knocking radiator. The one small room, and I watched Vanessa take it in. And I watched something cross her face that I think was the very beginning of a question she didn't yet know how to ask. I'd set the box in the center of the table, where a centerpiece would go. Just the box. Closed. Pal. Its well-fitted lid. Vanessa's eyes kept going to it. I don't think she'd expected to see it again. I think she'd hoped it would simply disappear. The way uncomfortable things have always disappeared for people who've never had to handle their own discomfort. We ate first. I insisted on it. You don't do the hard thing on an empty stomach. And I wanted everyone fed and unable to say afterward they'd been ambushed. Then I cleared the plates. And I laid my hand flat on the lid. I'd like to give my son and his wife their wedding gift now. I said, properly, the way Joseph asked me to. Before he died. The table went still. Daniel's upset. Sharon put down her wine. Vanessa went carefully blank. Vanessa. I said. Warm and even, and not unkind, which somehow made it land harder. 10 days ago, you held this box. And you shook it to see if it was empty. And you decided what it was worth. And you held its contents up for a laugh. I'd like to show you, and everyone here, what you were actually holding. And I opened the box. I took out the folded deed and smoothed it on the cloth. I took out the little pouch of dirt and set it beside it. I lifted the ribbon stack of receipts and laid them down like a hand of cards. This dirt, I said. Your husband's great-grandfather carried out of a field he cleared by hand. An immigrant who got off a boat with $11 and bought 11 acres nobody else wanted. He pulled the stones out of that ground for 30 years and built them into the walls that still stand on it. He made the very thing that made it worthless into the thing that holds it together. I touched the receipts. These are 60 years of this family nearly losing that land and refusing to. Every lean year. Every payment your husband's grandmother made selling eggs at the roadside. They kept the receipts so that whoever came next would know what it cost to hold on. I rested my hand on the deed. And this is the deed to those 11 acres. I had them valued last week. With the way the city's grown. They're worth just over $600,000. The number went around the table like a draft under a door. Sharon's mouth opened. Vanessa had gone very pale. And this, I said, setting the sealed envelope down as gently as you'd lay down a sleeping child, is the last letter your husband's father ever wrote. Dictated to me in a hospital bed, to be read the night you moved onto that land, so that a man who couldn't be at your wedding could give you the only thing he had to give. I looked at Vanessa, and I kept my voice as soft as I have ever kept it, which I think was worse than shouting. This is what you held up for a laugh. Dear, 100 years. $600,000. And a dying man's letter to his son. This is what you called old family junk. This is what you'd have thrown out. Asking instead for cash. Vanessa did what Vanessa does. She reached. At once. For the version where she was the wronged one. You can't put this on me, she said. Voice climbing. Who puts a deed in a box that looks like trash? Who does that? You let me sit there and that's a setup. You wanted me to look bad. I didn't let you do anything. Vanessa, I said. Still calm. Joseph asked, with nearly his last breath. That this not be handed over as paper in an envelope, that whoever received it hold the whole 100 years in their hands and understand it first. The plainness was the whole point. We have always hidden what we treasure inside things that don't look like much. Because the people in this family learned the hard way that easy is how you lose what was hard to get. My one mistake, and I'll grant you this one, was assuming no one would hold up a battered box an old woman carried in like glass. And laugh. Without once wondering why she carried it that way. The carrying was love. The laugh was entirely yours. It was a gift table, she said. We asked for cash. Everyone knew we asked for. You asked for cash. I said gently. I know. That's rather the whole problem. I folded my hands. You were taught to trust only what you can count today. Vanessa. And I'm sorry for that. Because it was taught to you by a frightened woman and it isn't your fault. You believed it. But it left you unable to see the one priceless thing on that table. Because it came as a story instead of a sum. And it nearly cost your own husband the last land his family owns. And the last words his father will ever say to him. Sharon started to speak. Now that is hardly, and I turned my eyes to her. Onze. Sharon. I said. You taught her to count. I'd sit this one out. Sharon sat it out. Then I told them what I'd decided. Because mercy and consequence can share a table. And I'd raised Daniel to know the difference, even when, for years, he couldn't bring himself to practice it. I told them about the trust the land held for a grandchild not yet born. Unsellable for quick cash. Released only to an heir who opens the box and reads the letter aloud first. If that's your child someday, Vanessa, I said, then it's theirs. And gladly. That part was always going to be up to you. Daniel nodded slowly. And I saw, with a small ache, that he understood the lock included his own household, and didn't argue because he knew he'd earned it. Sitting at a long table, laughing softly, looking down at his plate. Then I picked up Joseph's letter, and my hands shook. And I read my husband's last words to his family. In the kitchen of the apartment, I moved into the year I sold our home. Daniel. I read, if you're hearing this, you've found someone to build a life with. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there to shake his hand or hers. I never had much to leave you. No money to speak of. What I have is 11 acres my grandfather cleared with his hands because nobody else would have them. And the stones he turned into walls. And the dirt itself, which is the only inheritance that ever mattered. Here is what I learned from 3 generations on that ground. So, the world will always tell you the valuable thing is the one you can cash today. The world is wrong. The valuable thing is almost always the one somebody held on to when it would have been easier to let go. Don't measure what you're given by what it would sell for. Measure it by what it cost the person to keep it for you. Your mother knows this better than anyone alive. My voice broke here. And I let it, though she'll never tell you how she knows it. Be the kind of man who holds on. All my love. Dad. The room was silent. Ruth was weeping openly. Daniel had his face in his hands. And Vanessa was looking at the little pouch of dirt in the center of the table, the dirt she'd pinched between 2 fingers and, I think for the very first time, actually seeing it, it was too late to be forgiveness. But it might. Just might. Have been the beginning of learning how to look. Now here is how it shook out in the months after Tine. Because I know you want the ledger, and not only the feeling, the trust is locked and waiting. Patient as the stone walls Tomas built. Doing exactly what 3 generations meant it to. It can't be reached until there's a child grown enough to open the box and mean the words. The dinner where Vanessa held the dirt up for a laugh had been filmed. A cousin had been recording toasts. The way people do. Enough of the family saw it that Vanessa spent a long, quiet season known in her own circle as the woman who laughed at her husband's inheritance and called it junk. I did not do that to her. She did it in front of 60 witnesses and a camera. There's a lesson in that. 2. About performing for a room. Sharon and I will never be close. But she has stopped asking what Daniel and I have, which I count as a diplomatic victory. Vanessa and I are careful with each other. She has never fully apologized. She isn't built for it yet. And I've stopped needing her to be. But a month after the dinner, she asked me, in a small voice, if I would take her up to see the land. I did. She stood at the top of the cleared field where Tomas pulled the first stones, and she put her hand flat on one of the walls, and she didn't say anything about what it was worth. She just asked, quietly, how a person clears a field by hand. It's a start. Daniel is the one who changed the most. Shame did for him what 34 years of comfort never could. It grew him a backbone. He came to me alone a few weeks later, sat at the table where the box had been, and said, I've been replaying it, and I keep landing on the same thing. I didn't fail Dad when I laughed at that table. I failed him 100 times before that. Every time I went quiet to keep the peace. The laugh was just the one I can't unhear. He turned his cup in his hands. And you sold the house. You've known that about yourself for 9 years, and you carried it alone so I wouldn't have to. He looked up. I'm done choosing easier. I'm choosing it on purpose now. He and Vanessa are in counseling, which I never thought I'd see. And he started driving up to the land on weekends, mending a stretch of Tomas's wall, 1 stone at a time, learning by his hands what his father couldn't teach him in words. That's new, and I'm proud of him. Better late. As for me, Daniel asked me, that night at the table, to move out of the rented apartment. He wanted to buy back the blue house. Or one like it. I told him no. Not because I'm proud, but because I've made my peace with thin walls, and because a debt repaid in a house would turn the thing I gave freely into a transaction, and I won't have it. What I want from my son isn't my house back. It's the man who mends walls. I already got that. It's worth more than the brick. If there's one thing I'd hand you from all of this, it's this. The world will tell you, louder every year, that worth is a number you can collect today, that the real gift is the check, and the rest is sentiment. Don't you believe it? The most valuable thing in any room is almost always the plain one. The one that doesn't shine. That somebody held on to through years. It would have been easier to let go. So, learn how to look. And whatever you love, hold on to it, past the point where letting go gets easy, and never, ever let anyone tell you it belongs in the trash. That's my story. 1 wooden box. 1 cruel laugh. And 100 years of holding on. Worth more than all the cash they asked for. If it reminded you of something plain that you still treasure, a thing somebody kept for you when it would have been easier to let it go, go and tell them tonight. While you can. Leave a comment and tell me what it was. Hit subscribe. And I'll see you next time. A stone wall is not built from the easy parts of a field. It is built from what the field refuses to hide, the rocks that break the plow, slow the hands, and make impatient people call the land useless. Tomas did not throw those stones away. He lifted them, en ebiwan, and turned the problem into the boundary. That is what holding on really means. It is not pretending the hard years did not happen. It is building with them until even the burden has a place. That was the lesson Vanessa missed when she shook the box and listened for cash. Some inheritances do not rattle. Some arrive quietly, folded in old paper, wrapped in dirt, tied with receipts, waiting for someone patient enough to understand them. Money can tell you what land might sell for, but it cannot tell you what it cost a family not to sell it. The deed showed ownership, the dirt showed belonging. The receipts showed endurance, and a person who cannot respect all three is not ready to receive any one of them. Scriptwriter Nguyen Van Chien.